Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul.
Penis Paul.
Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul. My boy Jake Paul. 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 Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul,
Penis Paul.
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. I'm a Jake Pauler. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. We at 50. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul.
Penis Paul. Oh, you're still active.
Jake Paul, 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 Jake Pauler, Jake Pauler. Jake Pauler, Jake Pauler, Jake Paul, Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. We had 102. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. I mean Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul is my freaking hero. Jake Pauler for life. Jake Paul. 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 Jake Paul, 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 but Jake Paul, 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 200. Let me set up the camera differently over here, maybe. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Rice Gum, oh gotcha! Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, what the heck? Jake Paul, 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 Jake, oh, subscribe to his YouTube channel, what is it again?
Perry_Fig, #penis.
It's Perry_Fig, #penis.
That's not my YouTube channel.
Oh, it's just Perry_Fig.
I'm gonna think you're watching.
It's Perry_Fig. Go subscribe. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Oh, we're at 300. I didn't even notice we're at 300 now. Jake Paul, 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 Logan Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. It's every day, bro, with that Disney Channel flow. 5 mil on YouTube in 6 months. Never know one more. Jake Paul. Plus one. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Wait, I need to do something real quick. We're at 300, right? Yeah, last time I checked, we were at 300. So 300, and then plus one. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake freaking Pauler. I'm a Jake Pauler, I'm a Jake Pauler, I'm a Jake Pauler. Jake Pauler, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 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 Jake Paul.
Large
Jake
sack
Paul.
Paul.
Large sack Paul. Large sack Paul, guys. Jake Paul, 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 Jake, shut up. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Stop. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, you know you're cleaning that up. Jake Paul, 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 get Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 400.
Oh, it's right here.
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Switch angle.
It's so you don't know it's on loop. It's so
Jake Paul,
it's
Jake
so you
Paul,
know
Jake
it's
Paul.
not on loop.
Yeah, I know.
This is not
And-
on loop to video.
And also, I've been just like moving around the whole time anyway.
See,
Jake
you can tell
Paul,
it's
Jake
not
Paul,
like-
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. I don't even know how to loop. Jake Paul, 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 Jake stop. Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul.
I'm pooping. Yeah.
Jake Paul, 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 Jake Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Oh, 500! Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake freaking Paul, Jake 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 Perry, stop. Stop trying to get in the video, go do your homework. Jake Paul, 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 Jake stop. Stop. Stop, go do your homework. Jake Paul, stop. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Oh! Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 600.
I was gonna say you should send this to Jake Paul, but I said penis Paul a lot.
Yeah, and I'll just be
Now you can.
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul,
Penis
Jake
Paul,
Paul,
penis
Jake
Paul,
Paul.
penis.
Stop. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Stop. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Stop. Perry, you know mom's gonna see this. Yeah, so all that penis Paul stuff. Okay, Jake Paul, 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 Jake freaking whoa! Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake. I'm trying to get comfy, guys. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake. Oh, 700! Almost 2,000. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Wait, focus. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul.
What do we need to do? And so Chip is throwing out some.
Yeah, I'm so white now. Guys, I accidentally undid the other video when I was trying to adjust the sighting. Right now I'm on 723. Last time I showed you I was at 700. I said 23 of them in the mids of when I accidentally turned off the film. So I'm gonna keep going on and saying Jake Paul, 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 focus, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Focus on me.
If they want to kind of go a step further.
Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Stop. You know mom's gonna see this. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. You can do whatever you want in the background as long as you don't talk. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. I said background. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 800. Stop! Before I mall grab hit you in the face. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Focus. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake.
Oh, Miles?
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Stop! Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Oh, and if you guys don't think I'm actually doing it, look right there. Do you see the time?
You were gonna stack up place, do a really cool piece piece of wood on the top.
Just change to one. You're right there, shit. It's right there. Jake Paul, 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 Jake. Focus me, Jake Paul, Jake. Focus me, Jake Paul, 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 Jakey Pauly, Jake Pauler, Jake Pauler, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 900! 900. 900. 900. Jake Paul's. Okay. What the frick? Okay, bye, Grandma. Bye. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. I feel like sitting down now. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Focus me, Jake Paul, 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 Jake 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 Paul. I mean Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Last Jake Paul. Oh man, I just said it. 1,000! 1,000 Jake Pauls! 1,001. Okay, I already ended it. Okay, thank you for watching this YouTube video. There'll be a real video tomorrow. That was me singing Jake Paul 1,000 times. Goodbye, Cringe Nation. I'll see y'all later.